There are continuing reports from around the world of people experiencing adverse health impacts from living near industrial wind turbines. But is this just a psychological thing, a psychosomatic reaction, a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory, or is there something to this? Well, we have an expert now to answer those questions next on Wind Concerns. Hello, I'm Mark Mallett, Editor-in-Chief at Wind Concerns, and I'm happy to have with us Dr. Mariana Alves-Peirera from Lisbon, Portugal. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's get right to it. There is a whole stream of thought out there. I've talked to the news reporters. I've talked to people in my community, and we certainly hear from the wind industry that there's no basis for people getting sick. There's no connection between wind turbines and all the symptoms we're hearing about of people getting nausea, losing their sleep, dizziness, heart rhythms changing. And then we get into the animals, birth effects, all this stuff. They say, no. This is, as one critic of yours, his name's Michael Bernhard, said, this is pseudoscience. A case study, he said, of the rhetorical tricks, and he's talking about you, of a fake disease anti-wind advocate. So before we go any further, Dr. Alves-Peirera, you are a PhD in environmental sciences, is that correct?
Yes. My thesis was infrasound and low-frequency noise in public transportation.
Okay, so you just said the word infrasound. Now, I know from my research, but we'll get you to explain this. There's the audible portion we hear from wind turbines. Now, there's people who have a new wind factory just went online south of us here in Alberta, and the people who live near it describe the sound coming from it that they can hear is like a jet engines, they say, when the wind is really blowing. And I've heard this description from other people in the United States, this constant noise like a jet engine hovering above their home. Now, I can speak for myself, that would drive me crazy. That would impact my health. Okay, I think everybody agrees with that. The wind industry is always talking about how they're going to reduce the audible sound. But today, that's not what we're talking about. What we want to talk about is what you said, infrasound, which is this inaudible portion of sound. And now, am I describing that correctly?
Yes, Mark, in fact, you are. I like to refer to infrasound as like the X-rays of sound. So as in the electromagnetic spectrum, we have a little portion that is visible to the eye and everything else isn't. The same occurs in the acoustic spectrum, where we have a portion that is audible, but then we have the inaudible portion, which if you have enough exposure time, just like X-rays, you can get sick.
And so, but I mean, is this just, is it a psychosomatic thing? Are people just kind of, I don't like these wind turbines, they're bugging me, and and now I'm sick? I mean, is this what's going on around the world?
Well, no, that would mean that it's a psychosomatic. It would be a disease of a psychosomatic origin. You see, when we have wind turbines or infrasound in general, we're talking about a mechanical pressure wave that comes through the air and impacts your body. The peculiarity of wind turbines, though, as opposed to other infrastructure, is that the output, the infrasonic output of wind turbines is a pulsed pressure wave. So yes, it's not audible, and yet the brain processes this information of this pulsed pressure wave. Your cells all over your body are also feeling this pulsed pressure wave. Your ear, however, is not processing it. And so we can't necessarily hear the infrasound, but it can most definitely affect our bodies and those of animals, which brings me, since you mentioned it, this psychosomatic nocebo effect. It's again, it's a two-pronged answer, but all we have to do is look at the animals, right? Because if the
Okay.
animals are getting sick as well, then out goes through the window the idea that it's psychosomatic in origin. If the animals are getting sick as well, which they are, right? Um, but on the other hand, if people really want to prove that it's psychosomatic, well, then we should, put in medical sciences and the axioms of medical sciences and give people medical diagnostic tests that prove that it's psychosomatic, but they're not doing that.
Well, in the wind industry, the big study that is cited all the time is the Health Canada study that was done, I think, around 2011-ish. And this is the one, to this day, they constantly cited as having evidence that there's just annoyance, is what they called it, from wind turbines. Your comments on that study, because it's a major weapon being used right now. I call it a weapon in the wind industry.
Yeah, well, it's a weapon like a paper tiger because there's no scientific background to that study. Look, as far as I know, they're measuring noise in dBA, so they're not even capturing the infrasonic spectrum. So right there, what are you studying exactly? Then they are measuring outside the homes, and I want to know what people are exposed to when they're in their homes. I mean, they're not sleeping in the garden. I want to know what's happening in their bedrooms because that's where the problem really comes in, right? And then there's this I don't know where these medical people are coming from, but everybody who is old school science and real school science knows that when you're studying a physical agent of disease, as opposed to a biological, virus, a bacteria, as opposed to chemical, as opposed to psychosocial, when it's a physical agent of disease, you have to take into account prior exposures. This is true for infrasound. It's true for radiation, and they're not doing that. So to take into account prior risk exposures requires that you have individual interviews with every single subject that you're including in the study, and they're not doing that. And so it's impossible for them to stratify their study population in terms of prior exposure to infrasound and low frequency noise.
Right. And you're making a point there. The Health Canada study, apparently they didn't even talk to people who were experiencing severe health symptoms. How do you study an issue like that without even talking to the victims?
Well, didn't they do telephone interviews evaluating annoyance? Isn't that wonderful? That's great medical science, isn't it? Telephone interviews evaluating annoyance. I think that's what they did. If I recall, okay. It's been some years already.
Well, Doctor, we're also seeing now the courts are acknowledging this. So now we're suddenly going from the realm of being called, they're calling this conspiracy theory, to the courts are actually acknowledging the health impacts on people, and they're using the words coined by Dr. Nina Pierpont, PhD as well, as wind turbine syndrome. Is that a proper terminology for these health effects that people are experiencing?
Well, see, in medical sciences, we use the word syndrome when we don't know what the causative agent is. For example, AIDS, right? AIDS was syndrome, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, because we didn't know what it was. When we figured out that it was this virus, HIV virus, then we stopped calling it AIDS and we started calling it something else, right? Because now It's no longer a syndrome. We know what the causative agent is. Of course, Dr. Nina Pierpont is a medical doctor, so she's not into the acoustics. So she didn't have the equipment to prove what was the agent of disease that was present. All she could do as a medical professional was to tally all the symptoms that were there in the people she studied. And she correctly termed it wind turbine syndrome because she did not have the equipment and the technology to actually measure the agent of disease that was the causative effect of, or the causative factor of these collections of symptoms. So yes, we don't call it wind turbine syndrome, but yes.
Right. And so there was a case in France where they did award the plaintiffs regarding what they were experiencing, and now we just see this. The week of this interview, we've heard that a wind farm has been closed for the first time in France due to not only bird deaths but again to noise, which again is not always the when we talk about noise, it's not just what you hear, it's what you feel. And that you can't hear. Now, here's the big question. Is this just for people who live a few hundred meters from turbines, or how far away do you have to be in order to experience these ill health effects from turbines?
Well, you see, there's a study out of Finland where they studied or tallied the complaints of people living at 2 kilometers away from the power plant, 5 kilometers, and then 10 kilometers. And they found that, of course, the people that had the most severe complaints were the ones living 2 kilometers away. But people living 10 kilometers away had more severe complaints than those living at 5 kilometers away.
Wow.
Okay. All of this has to do with the propagation of infrasound in the air. Right? So here comes this wave, and it's a pulsed wave, it's a pressure wave, it's a mechanical wave. Here comes this wave, and now it's on a prairie, right? So there's no obstacles. It can just keep on going for very, very extensive kilometers. But now compare with if you have a mountain range, right? So now the propagation will be different if you have mountain ranges there. So it depends on terrain. I personally would not live 50 kilometers away from them. And particularly now because
Wow.
they're getting ever so big. Yeah.
50 kilometers.
Yes, 50.
Wow. So now, what have you been in? Now, this study you did mention the Finnish study. This is their graphic actually on the screen. They found adverse health effects went up to 15 kilometers and began to drop off up to 20 kilometers. So now we're talking about people being impacted who can't even see these turbines, but are experiencing ill health effects.
Yep. I mean, but yes, it's just like radiation. Or even the soot from coal mining, right? That doesn't stay restricted to that little area. It spreads out. Depends on winds, depends on terrain, depends on 1,000 factors, but it spreads out. So to think that you can keep these sorts of contaminants contained in a specific space is unrealistic.
Well, we were shocked in our research when, because I'm not a lobby group. I get people in the renewable energy. They always accuse us of being a lobby group, and they say, "Who funds you?" Obviously, thinking that we're funded by the fossil fuel industry, and we're not. I'm actually just I started this website that you're looking at because there is a planned wind turbine. I don't call it a farm. I call it a factory planned right beside our homes here in the Northern Valley of Alberta. And we began to research Dr. Mariana, and we were shocked to hear what was happening in Ontario, where people were literally being driven from their homes and they couldn't return. And there's a dossier now that was presented to the Premier, Doug Ford. I'm told thousands of testimonies of people in Ontario who've experienced these ill health effects. And to this day, many people have not been able to sell their homes or even return to them. Is this the kind of thing you're also hearing there as well?
That's going on all over the world where they have wind turbines. All over the world. It's everywhere. Ireland, Scotland, Portugal, everywhere. They sell they can't sell their homes. They can't live in their homes. They're still paying their home to the bank, right? There are awful, awful cases. There's a case in Australia. It was a young couple. They had just married, and they were buying this home, and all of a sudden, they had a mortgage, right? So all of a sudden, all these wind turbines came and they couldn't stay there. So the family kicked in and helped out, and they were able to, give the house back to the bank. But then they went and bought another house. And need I say what happened there, right? Of course, wind turbines came there as well. And so,
Oh no.
yeah, it's, I'm laughing, but it's so horrible. It's so horrible.
It's
People,
tragic.
yeah, yeah.
That's right. And there was just a story. It was published in May 2022 by Ottawa Wind Concerns, another group that's been fighting turbines in their community, and they found that people's health actually returned when the wind turbines were shut down. I can't remember if it was maintenance or what it was. Are you finding in your studies, Dr. Mariana, that there are that when people leave the area, or again when they're shut down, that the health symptoms go away?
Well, of course, because you see, when you're in an infrasound contaminated home, it's like, you're being exposed to a contaminant, to an agent of disease. You get the person out of that environment, away from the agent of disease, and they start getting better. The same thing happens with chemicals, right? I mean, imagine the person is completely, in a home full of some chemical vapor and they're getting sick. You take them out of the home and they'll start to get better. I mean, it's logical.
So this is the same thing, right? Now, I've also noted in your research that the height of a wind turbine is actually a significant factor in the health impacts on people, which concerns me because they're planning to put 207-meter high towers right beside our houses out in this community. And I don't think there's any tower that high in this province at all. And we feel like we're being experimented on. So is there a causal relationship between tower height and health impacts?
Well, it's not so much the tower height, but the blade length. So there are people who for years have been living near little wind turbines, right? The ones that are like 70 meters high, and they're fine. They have no complaints. But little wind turbines also means littler blades. So when you have nowadays, the higher the wind turbine, the bigger the blade can be, the longer the blade can be. And the bigger the blade, as it rotates, the more air is going to be displaced. And it's that displacement of air that causes and then constitutes this pulsed pressure wave that emanates off of the wind turbine. So the bigger the blade, the stronger the wind turbine acoustic signature is going to be.
And so the bigger the signature, then it seems to be that the bigger the health impacts. Is that correct? That there's a correlation there?
Yes, again, if you're exposed to a contaminant and it's bad for you, if you increase the amount of contaminant, it's going to be worse for you. I mean, that's how the human body works.
And this should be, I guess, to put this in perspective, you had mentioned to me earlier when we were talking about if you just go to a disco club or a dance club, you can feel the bass. And sometimes I've been to concerts in places where I have felt it, and it's an awful feeling when they've really got that cranked. But there's another thing, too, and that's that the military is actually using infrasonic pulses to control crowds. So these are, again, pulses that you can't hear, but boy, you feel them. So the idea that this is conspiracy theory to me seems ridiculous when we're actually using this as a military application.
Well, Mark, it's even more ridiculous when you think about, for example, the Russian Federation has infrasound legislated. And it's legislated both for occupational exposures and for environmental exposures. Obviously, the infrasonic permissible exposure levels for infrasound in the environment are lower than the ones stipulated for occupational exposures. This is in legislation in the Russian Federation. So the Chinese are studying infrasound for a great many years. The French used to study the effects of health on infrasound. In fact, I think it's relevant to mention, in 1978, they were studying infrasound on genetically deaf mice. So they're deaf. So there's nothing going in through the ear, right? So you expose them to infrasound and their performance decreases just like the hearing rats. So how do you explain that? They're genetically deaf, and yet infrasound exposure decreases their performance as it does to the hearing rats. So since 78, we know that infrasound affects mammalian cells, affects cell structures other than through the ear. Most recently, or more recently, the Germans have shown that infrasonic acoustic events are captured by the brain, but not processed through the auditory system. They're processed directly by the brain, and they do not go through the auditory system. So,
Yeah. It's fascinating, but actually horrifying at the same time, and this brings up another subject because again, the wind industry will say, well, this is in people's heads, but you raised a point earlier that animals are also experiencing ill health effects around wind turbines. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, in Denmark, a mink farm had to close down because the wind turbines made it that the mink became very aggressive. The increased number of abortions in the mink were tremendous, and they were very aggressive. When they were put together to mate, they would attack each other instead. So this is in minks in Denmark. There's a rabbit farm that had to close down in Spain also because of the wind turbines being so close that the rabbits were going nuts, and it wasn't just economically viable to continue with the farm. There are cows in France that are being greatly affected. The milk that is being produced is below quality to be sold, so the farmers are really feeling that. We have sheep in Australia that are dying or having abortions because they're living under wind turbines. But the clincher is, back in the 90s, we've shown in laboratory what happens not only to mice or rats that live in the noise, but also to the offspring. So we have rats who were born in noise of mothers who were exposed to this noise, infrasonic and low frequency, and and they're sick. The animals are sick. So if it's psychosomatic, if it's nocebo, if it's because they just want money, well, how do we explain the animals, right?
Right, because the animals don't really know what's going on. They just feel something and they try and get away from it. And you're absolutely right, Doctor. This was recognized again in that court case in France where they looked at the Bradford causality and effect study. And they found in this study that there were cases all around the globe. So we're not just talking, France or Europe. We, as you have rightly pointed out, these health effects are impacting animals all over the world. And we haven't been able to confirm it yet here at Wind Concerns, but we've heard now from 3 different people that a wind farm not far from here where there's a dairy barn and a chicken egg producing farm, the egg production has gone down as well as the milk production. And, I think some of these people, they don't talk about it because they're under a non-disclosure agreement that they signed with the wind turbine company. Now they're in trouble and they can't do anything about it.
I know there's particularly with livestock, like we're working a case right now, and it's a large farm with like 400 sheep or something. And the sheep numbers, since the wind turbines have gone up, are horrible. But the owners of the farm are very reluctant to give us factual numbers because then the market for their sheep will obviously be questioned, right? Because,
right.
Well, you came and you said that, your sheep are sick because when you want me to buy your sheep, I'm not going to buy your sheep. So it's very complicated. And also because when, since governments are kept in the dark on purpose or not, I'm not sure, but these people, when the agricultural department of their country, right, when they find out that all these animals are dying, the people fear that the agricultural people will come after them saying, you're not treating your animals right because they're dying off. So what are you doing to them? You see, there's it's very complicated, socially speaking, in terms of society. It's very complicated. People won't say what's going on because they fear other repercussions. So
we had one woman come up, a dramatic story, come to one of our community meetings to discuss this proposed project here. And Dr. Alves-Peirera, she said she has 10 mares when she lived in Ontario, 10 mares that were for breeding. And when the wind turbines went online, all 10 of her mares went sterile. So sterility and birth defects also seems to be, from what we are researching, part and parcel of this. I mean, this is a horror show.
It's awful. Look, we have they're called teratogenic defects, so the ones that are genetic, right? We have this in our laboratory. We have it in the horses, in the Portuguese case, the horses there. We have it in Australia in the eggs of turkey and chickens, where the eggs are, the calcium part, so the shell of the egg, it's completely deformed and everything is, and some of the chicks that were born in this infrasound environment, they have deformities on their feet, just like our rats in the laboratory. But the influence on the reproductive system of both male and female animals was studied by the Chinese back in the early 2000s. So we know it's not like the science isn't there, right? Now, here's what the wind industry will say. Oh, but all these Russian and Chinese studies, it's not wind turbine noise. They're right. It's not. It's not a pulsed wave. Usually when the Russians and the Chinese are studying the effects of infrasound, it's to protect the workers, right? And it's infrequently found. This pulsed infrasound is infrequently found. So it's a mess. It's a big mess.
Right. And here's the problem is with this push toward net zero emissions in countries and the push for renewable energy, which is huge. There's discussions. I just read one statistic that 3.8 million more wind turbines need to go up around the world. These things aren't like a little gas plant or even a nuclear power facility. These things take up thousands of acres, often of prime farmland. But here's the thing. There doesn't seem to be a brake on the pedal, and we're looking at thousands more of these coming into our communities. This sounds to me like a health crisis that's just about to explode, and it already is, as you've described it. In other countries, in Ontario, in southern Alberta, we're speaking to a woman who's experiencing this in her home. How do we stop this?
Well, I have no idea. I can't tell you how surprised I was when I was contacted by Israeli people who were worried about wind turbines because the Israeli government was going to put wind turbines up in the Golan Heights. And I'm like, what? Look, we all know. And I just asked them, do you know how easy it is to take down a wind turbine? All you need is to fly a drone into one of the blades, and that wind turbine is out of commission. You have to stop it, bring in a new blade. I mean, what kind of protection in a country like Israel and in the Golan Heights? They want to put a wind power plant there. I mean, just the money they're going to have to spend protecting it, so. But then why would Israel want wind turbines? Do they not have nuclear energy? Why would they want them? What is the trade-off here? I mean, I don't understand it. As far as I know, and this is far beyond my area of expertise, but as far as I understand it, they're not even economically viable were it not for government subsidies. So...
Right. And you're right that is what's happening. We're seeing that on the offshore turbine industry in particular, where they have literally stopped, at least in North America, wanting to build these until they get more money from the government. I mean, who starts a business that's not even economically viable? And of course, their whole argument is, well, we're saving the planet. But what you're talking about here, the impacts on human health, and doctor, we haven't gotten into the impacts on earthworms. There's now studies showing that earthworms actually vacate the areas, vacate the soil where these turbines go. Bat deaths, bird deaths. I mean, it's a horror show that we're hearing. But at the same time, we're starting to see there is a little bit of an acknowledgement in France, in Norway, where the governments and the courts are starting to recognize this and putting an end to it. I don't know, I'm hoping it's the beginning, but maybe I'm being too optimistic.
Well, I want to share your optimism, Mark. I really want to share your optimism. I hear that Wall Street understands that wind turbines are no longer a good investment. I hear that Wall Street people are now beginning to worry about future class actions, just as with the tobacco and asbestos and many other things. So maybe we're on an inflection point, right? That people like to talk about. Maybe just now we're in an inflection point. But there is a huge impetus to continue with these massive wind power plants, a huge impetus all over the world. So maybe it's the final grasp of hopefully, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and again, your expertise is in the vibroacoustic disease area, and we're actually seeing now, if you want to comment on offshore, whales are starting to show up dead on the beaches where these things have been. I mean, there seems to be nothing in creation that is not being harmed by these ugly monoliths.
It would seem that way. As for offshore wind turbines, the European Commission has already had two meetings, or European Parliament. I'm sorry, I don't know which one all of a sudden, but they already organized two meetings promoted by the fishermen of Europe, who no longer have any fish to fish because these giant wind turbines are now in the sea. So the fish are gone. Apparently, there's an enormous increase in mussels, in the mussel population. I think the number is like 310% increase in mussel population in the oceans of northern Germany. And so it's it's just another, the infrasonic output of wind turbines is not only can it propagate to very large distances. So, for example, I would not live 50 kilometers away from a wind power plant, but that's me.
Wow. Yeah.
So the way infrasound propagates, it just nothing stops it almost. In fact, that's how we control and monitor who's exploding nuclear weapons. We have 60 infrasound monitoring stations around the world, and it belongs to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And what they do is they measure when is there a peak of infrasound that comes off some nuclear explosion that somebody isn't supposed to do. So that's what those are then. Why do they use infrasound? Because it travels unimpeded for many, many, many kilometers. It's a problem.
Right. So there you have it. You're saying 50 kilometers away. I mean, that is stunning. I mean, right where I sit right now, I am 50 kilometers away from an industrial wind factory. But the one they're proposing here, Doctor, people will be under a kilometer, within hundreds of meters, and they're terrified. And there are people losing. You want to talk about health problems? They've even begun for people even before these are erected, because they're learning, they're getting educated about the harms of these things, and they're terrified. And it really is It's an engine that started like a train that's out of control. But we're hopeful. We're hopeful with good scientists like you who are putting out good evidence. And I mean, this hasn't stopped the industry, mind you, from claiming that you are what did he call you, a false anti-wind pseudoscience junkie. I mean, how do you respond to something like that if even you bother?
Well, look, this is, I've been at this since 1988. And before wind turbines, it was the military, and then it was governmental infrastructure, airports, dams, bridges, things like this. So it's always against the big guys, so to speak, with this infrasound thing. As to the, critiques, I usually say, look, this is like guerrilla warfare, right? So here comes this guy. What's his name again? The Bernard.
Michael Bernard, I think. Yeah.
Here he comes, and he throws a grenade, right? And he runs away, right? And all I'm saying is, look, I want hand-to-hand combat. Come back, fight me right here, right now. Let's have a debate. Let's have a debate so everybody knows. They won't do it, of course. But that's what it is. They do not want hand-to-hand combat. They're using guerrilla tactics in terms of science, and that's what they've always done. That's what they've always done. If you, if you go back into our group's history, which, again, it began in 1980s in the Portuguese Air Force. I came in 1988. You should see what Air Force officials would say, and other doctors. So,
right. Okay. Well, you threw the. Yeah, I was going to say, you threw the gauntlet out there, and I would certainly invite Michael Bernard, if he wants to come on to this webcast and have a scientific debate with you. That would be great. But I think we are living in a different climate now, Doctor, where it doesn't matter if you have PhD behind your name. If you put into question the great narrative that is out in the media, suddenly you're a cartoon figure. You're just a conspiracy theorist and tinfoil hat wearer. I find it disgusting. I see it in publications like De Smog and others where they absolutely denigrate people who are just putting out the science there. I mean, in some ways, I feel like science is dead. We can't have scientific conversations, and that's certainly the case we're seeing with infrasonic sound in wind turbines.
Yes, absolutely. Science, that's why I now refer to myself as an old school scientist, where certain things were required. It's today it's like, oh, well, that's it really. So you go and look at the methodology. It used to be the case that you publish a paper, and I don't like what your paper says. I don't like your results. You go against what I'm saying. I don't like it. But in old school science, I have to go to your methodology. If I cannot find anything in your methodology that would detract from your results or justify wrong results, science says I have to accept your results because I find no flaw in your methodology. Oh, yes, it may be inconvenient, maybe make me lose a lot of money, may even make me lose face, in front of certain groups of people, right? But as a real scientist, if you have nothing to say about the methodology of a certain paper or a certain study, then you cannot critique, you cannot criticize the results. That's old school science. Nowadays, nobody looks at the methodology. Methodology is all wrong. For example, in this Health Canada study that has been ongoing for several years, the methodology, in my opinion, and I'll challenge anybody to discuss this with me, the methodology is wrong. It's wrong in medical sciences, and it's wrong in acoustics. So take your pick.
Wow. Yeah. Well, no, well said, Doctor. Well, I guess in closing, we see the courts now have vindicated you. We've seen in France, in Norway, and the courts now are vindicating your research, that of Dr. Nina Pierpont, acoustician Stephen Cooper, and we hope the tide is turning because the cost of this is huge. again, folks, people are losing their homes. They're being driven from their homes. Not everybody is experiencing these symptoms, because some people are acclimated, other people are more susceptible. All these kinds of things. But what we're seeing is the tide is beginning to turn, and the more that the public is educated, and I think that's the big thing, Dr. Mariana, is that the public needs to be educated. They just see these as big pinwheels out in the countryside, and they have no idea that this is ruining people's lives, ruining people's health. And your work coming out, and thank God for your old school science, is helping those of us who are fighting these scourges to hopefully bring them to an end. So I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll see if maybe your debate offer is out there, and that just tells me right away that you are interested in real science, because those who try and shut us down, we find they are constantly have nothing to back themselves up, or at the very best, they might have an industry-funded science study that conveniently is done the wrong way. The methodology is terrible, and I think you've encountered that too.
Yes, it's terrible. It's not only in the wind turbine sector and the wind turbine and health sector, by the way, but yes. I don't know what happened to science. I'm appalled what is now called science nowadays. Right.
Dr. Alves-Peirera from the University of Lusofano in Lisbon, Portugal. And it's delighted to meet with you, and I thank you for this time, and I'm sure we will have you again, talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck with everything. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.